Yes.
Can you tell us a bit over it, over the books, and everything that you talked
Right.
to our blog?
Yes, okay. About 3 years ago, my husband, Alan Moore, who's always been writing since for long before I knew him, gave me the very flattering comment when I read him bits of my diaries about my old days in San Francisco. He said, well, you should publish these because they're very interesting, and it's about all the underground cartoonists like Robert Crumb and Gilbert Shelton and people like that. That whole movement has sort of passed away, and although Aileen Kaminsky, Robert Crumb's wife, did a book called Need More Love, she didn't talk an awful lot about the various people in the movement. Her book was more understandably about herself and her husband and their work. And what I thought was the most interesting feature of my memoirs were that they were always about other people. I copied down large amounts of conversations we all had. Excuse me. And my glass of water, thank you. And how strange and interesting all these people were. And it's as if one kind of wildlife has passed into non-existence and is no longer there. Our kind of zebras and gorillas have passed on, and San Francisco, where we came from, has changed a great deal. It was a very, very different place in the 60s and 70s and 80s than it is now. So, taking my husband's word as an act of faith, I started transcribing the 25 or so diaries that I'd kept during that period. And I wrote down what I felt were hopefully the most interesting parts of the diary, starting with when I was a young hippie at 17, running away from home and coming onto a San Francisco that still had influences of the beat movement left around the city in various restaurants and cafes. North Beach, which still is very much in the flavor of the old beat movement. There's actually a book that someone's done that's a kind of a walkthrough of the cafes and restaurants and bookshops that the beat poets and writers like Lawrence Ferlinghetti and Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac and people like that traveled through. And then, of course, there was a hippie movement with, the Avalon Ballroom and Janis Joplin, whom I met and talked about in my book. I went to one of her earliest performances with Big Brother and made acquaintance with some of the other members in the band and did a very early picture of Janis when I was still a teenager. And I've kept a lot of ephemera as well, a lot of photographs. I've done a lot of comic strips and drawings of the other cartoonists and of people that I met along the way, like William Burroughs, and a very famous local sculptor named Mark Pauline. And, I was very lucky. I got to be at the parties where the most interesting people were, whether they were from out of town or not, because San Francisco is actually a very small city, but it used to get a lot of literary attention, and then with the hippie movement it got a lot of musical attention. And also jazz personalities came through, like Mongo Santa Maria and Joseph Jarman from the Art Ensemble of Chicago. And I also met them. I met a lot of very interesting people and had conversations with a lot of them. And so this is what my diary is about, is the conversations, that came out of these people, the magnificent flora and fauna of a city who come through. And of course the punk movement, Mark Mothersbaugh and Devo came through town, the B-52s. A lot of interesting people came through. And so anyway, 3 years later, now that I've finished transcribing these early years of San Francisco, which cover from about including my running away from home, which was in the late 60s. I stayed in San Francisco till the early 80s, so I got involved with the punk movement as well. And then I got involved with the anti-nuclear movement, worked on a newspaper, an anti-nuclear newspaper. Then I worked on an expose of Ronald Reagan, which was called The Beginner's Guide to Ronald Reagan, and I illustrated that. And then in 1984, I left San Francisco and came to England, at which point I got involved with an anti-nuclear movie called When the Wind Blows. Raymond Briggs, yes, and worked on that for 11 months. And in the same diary, I talk in a certain amount of detail about handmade animation, which of course people don't do anymore. And this film was very much a handmade piece of animation. I also got involved in the underground scene in London, of sadomasochistic clubs. And
you worked on When the Wind Blows, right?
Yes, yes.
You did layouts and all that?
I was brought in to troubleshoot. The film was in financial trouble when I came into it. They'd had a £3 million budget and they'd already spent almost all of it. Mismanagement, poor projections, bad business. And I was brought in to try and help them come up with a rendering design which involves like certain kind of cells. It's sort of complicated, a bit boring if you're not into it. But you get this frosted cell that you can do rendering on top of. They couldn't afford a frosted cell, so they wanted to use a clear cell which you could actually use some kind of colored pencils or something, so you could put rouge on people's cheeks and do hand coloring. This was a film, I don't know if anybody's here's seen it, yeah, but it's all done in what looks like colored pencils.